Welcome to The Balancing Act, the podcast for mastering work, wealth and well-being, with me, your author and host, Sarah Brennand. Here we explore conversations, insights and expert advice through the lens of what truly drives high performance and sustainable success, aligning your money and mission, strengthening your mental and physical health, and creating a more intentional work-life balance. Each week, I'm joined by leaders, professionals and specialists who share how they navigate their own balancing act, along with practical tools and strategies that you can apply in yours. In this episode, I'm joined by Anne McClean, a wealth strategist and chartered financial planner whose expertise features throughout the book Balancing Act, Mastering Work, Wealth and Wellbeing, particularly within the money mission paradigm. We explore financial confidence, the emotional side of money, and how clarity around liquidity, structure, and long-term planning can shape real security at every stage of success. It's a practical conversation about making money work in service of the life you're building. Well, welcome, Anne, and thank you for joining me today. I know we've already spoke at length because of your significant financial expertise and therefore contribution to the book Balancing Act, specifically around the money and mission paradigm. I think what we're going to discuss today is pulling some of the key themes out so that listeners can get a real good understanding, specifically around our psychological association with money and some of the things that we can do to proactively scaffold our lives financially for success now, but also for our sustainable success in the future. So I think if we can start off talking about one of the key themes that's mentioned in the book, and this is about the spectrum of our perception of not enough, enough and plenty, and you know what that means and how we can be more proactive with planning our money.
Yeah. Well, I think it's, again, these terms are they're quite relative, because not enough for one someone could have the same kind of financial resources and be quite satisfied versus somebody who's not. So I think potentially it's all about what you value and what is important to you, and that's probably one of the first things to think about. I think if somebody's in a position where things are pretty tight, sometimes it's quite hard to see the wood for the trees almost. And what one part is to think about what from a very practical perspective, what income is coming in and what expenses are going out, and we all have a sort of fixed level of costs that to pay your council tax and to pay your mortgage or your rent or whatever it might be, and then it's working out what you've got above and beyond that, really. I think is probably the first practical thing that one can do. And none of us are taught about budgeting, or I think I keep hearing that it's in the in the financial curriculum at school, but then no one ever seems to think that it is. But I do know it is, because I've been and done talks in schools before now, but obviously it's not sinking in some way. So I think having an understanding of what your income is, i.e. after the tax, and if you're self-employed, you need to make allowances for the fact you're going to have a tax bill to pay, and especially if it's in your sort of first year, because you'll have to make payments on account the next year. So I think you need to be aware of how the tax works, what the tax is, what have you actually got left after you've paid tax, and as we all know, that tax burden's going up. So being aware of what you've got left after you've done that, I think, is quite key. And then understanding, after you've paid your fixed costs, what is left, then that can direct you as to how you might spend what is deemed to sort of be disposable. Now, obviously that will have different margins for different people, and again it depends on what you want as an individual to spend your money on. Do you want to go on holiday, a specific sort of holiday, versus are you going camping in the Peak District, or are you going to the Maldives? Because obviously there's a massive differential in cost, and part of that I think is depending on what you value. But I think there's a ideally you want to pay yourself, your kind of long-term self, before you indulge your present self, as it were. So that involves making sure that you're covered. I think there's a basic level of making sure that you are cushioned in the event of something unpleasant happening, i.e. if you couldn't work, or if generally if you couldn't work, or if you've got a family, if something happened, if something happened to you, you died, that there's a level of cushioning for you and your loved ones. And then beyond that, you're into things like, well, how much do I want to, what do I want to spend on the present day versus what I want to save for the future? There's sort of rules of thumb. And if you're in something like a group pension scheme with your employer, you'll often see something like the employer might put 5% in and you put 5% in. And it's very easy to think that is going to be enough to pay for kind of retirement. And the earlier you start, the truer that is, because you get, what Einstein described as the eighth miracle of the world, which is you're getting compound interest or compound investment returns. So i.e., you're getting growth on the growth on the growth, which over time snowballs into, can snowball into large amounts of money. But I think, that 5 and 5 isn't, we kind of anchor on that number, but that's not necessarily our number. That's just an arbitrary number that's been decided by your employer as to what they're going to pay into your pension, which isn't necessarily to do with your lifestyle. It's like, I remember talking to a family member, and they were doing the kind of default contribution into the pension scheme, whereas actually they could have paid more in than the employer would have paid more in. So, which makes sense to do, assuming that, but you need to understand it in the first instance, what is affordable. So, and that's down to, what are you earning, what are you paying in tax, what are your kind of costs, and then what's left. And then how are you going to decide how to spend what's left.
And I guess doing that with knowing what it is you want to achieve, or the things that because you mentioned the word, it depends what you value. And I think that's a very personal thing, isn't it? Where we want to go on holiday, and I think, and I know we've talked about this previously, that notion of perhaps your upbringing can to some extent dictate what you perceive to be enough and what you perhaps want a little bit more of. Because we all have a bit of a benchmark, don't we, I guess, in our mind, and some people kind of stay there, and some people actually across their lives drastically change from what they grew up having with what they now have. In terms of the clients that you work with or have worked with historically, is that notion of, everyday financial planning, is that actually quite common? Or because it feels like it's something that, you kind of said it's, we just do that basic, what do we earn, what do we want? I don't know whether all of us naturally do that, just from conversations I've had, to actually stop and go, hang on a minute, where am I at? What do I want to achieve, and how aligned am I financially?
No, I don't think people do that. I definitely don't think people do that. It's a bit like, so our training tells us that we should tell people, come in and ask people what their goals are. Well, I would say in my experience, most clients don't have a clue. I think they want to maintain their current lifestyle. I think it's a given, generally people want to maintain their current lifestyles or improve their current lifestyles. And I suppose there's something, so that kind of conditioning that we have, I think sometimes you have to stop and say, is this really what I want? We're all I think we're all conditioned to say, right, well, I want to buy a bigger house, or I want to go on a better holiday, I want to have a better car, but actually, what value do those things bring to me? And I think there's a lot of, money is a proxy for something, but that something will vary from client to client. So I think, I don't think most people do sit down and think about what they really want. But that's that's partly part of my role, in that you're getting people to think about it. And I think it needs to be a sort of iterative process as well. It's not something you can solve in one meeting, because you need to go and think about it, don't you? And I also think it's a moving feast. because what you want changes over your sort of, over your life, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely agree with that. Particularly with career stages, but also family stages as well, and that brings
Mm.
in, that responsibility. I certainly know from clients that I've worked with, as you get older, the notion of retirement, obviously, that gap gets smaller, doesn't it? And therefore, the importance that you place on it and the recognition of what you're doing now for your future self feels a bit closer to home than it did, when you're young and you think you've got ages to worry about that.
Well, this
Absolutely.
is right, and I think if you can do something in your 20s, then at least you've got a bit of a foundational start, because then what happens is, I don't know, you're getting on the property ladder, you're having children, and the opportunities to save, for most people get drastically reduced. So then you're having to try and play catch up in middle age, where, as you say, the spectre of retirement and have I got enough is sort of really coming up at a rate of knots. So yeah, I think taking time to think about it is quite important. I mean, most I think more people spend time researching what holiday they're going to go on than, there's that sort of these stats where, yeah, you're spending more time thinking about your mobile phone contract than your financial future. But I think I can sort of understand it, because it's a big, we're not trained for it, we're not educated in it, so it's also sort of slightly abstract. And again, we've all got the heuristic, haven't we, to be very much thinking about your future self than your present self than your future self. So that all those things are interplaying, I think, in terms of what's going on. I think the biggest differential I see, sort of unicorn founders aside, the biggest differential I see is people who actually say, that is going to be the largest determinant in a successful outcome, is the fact that you're saving in the first place, or investing, actually. Putting money aside regularly and investing for the future. That's a big thing.
So on that, in terms of the practicalities of finance and savings and investments, what is your, what are some simple tips or pieces of advice to, and well, first of all, go people who are employed, because I know that, it differs slightly, potentially, or some of the elements will, between people who are employed and people who are self-employed. So if we take the employed person first, what would be the key things that you would want to check, what they've got in place, or some of the tips that you would give them in terms of better kind of financially scaffolding their current and also their future life?
Yeah, I think, as I said, we've touched on it already. Are they maximising the opportunity offered by their sort of group personal pension scheme, or whatever the pension scheme might be on offer? Are they maximising the opportunity in that? Have they is salary slightly in the news at the moment, but is salary sacrifice something they've opted for if it's available? Because that gives you tax relief straight away up front, and is quite useful from a net perspective. What benefits are available from the employer? Because if, sometimes you've got flexibility in how you spend your kind of, your allowance, if you like. And if you're 20, for example, and you've got the option of getting rid of death in service, and redirecting some of that kind of budget to something that's going to be saving, then that would be a sensible thing to do. So I think being really conversant, if you're not sort of, you don't know what these things are, then I think, again, go and talk to the employer about what's on offer, and how, if there's information, I don't know, or there's a kind of session available, then you should absolutely kind of grab that with open arms. I think everybody needs to have a cash buffer, and that should probably be something like 3 to 6 months, well, anywhere between 3 and 12 months salary, or expenses, in cash available, and probably invested in a cash ISA, so that it's not, you're not generating anything that's going to be subject to tax. And then sort of beyond that, everybody should be investing. And then I think it becomes a choice between, are you investing in a pension, or are you investing in an ISA? I mean, there's also a sort of debate of, do you pay down mortgage? Do you pay down a bit extra on the mortgage, for example, assuming you've got a mortgage? So I think there's different option. Again, it's quite hard to have rules of thumb because it depends on where you
Yeah.
are. But
Yeah.
I think as an employee, I'd want to know exactly what benefits are on offer, and that I am, making the most of those benefits. For example, personally, my husband works for a large supermarket, and I hadn't realised up until the beginning of this year that there was an electric car scheme on offer, and it was by far, once I'd done the maths, it was by far the best way for us to have a car. So we've taken advantage of that. So, and also the benefits check, that wasn't there 12 months ago. So
Yeah.
again, checking in on what benefits are available. And as I say, have a certain amount of cash, and then beyond that, we all hold too much money in cash, which is obviously why the Chancellor is trying to change those cash ISA rules. We need to be a nation of investors, not savers. Like the Americans all are all interested in the stock market. They're much more conversant with it, and I think we could take for that we could take a leaf out of their book.
And is that something that you would recommend people research and do independently? Are there, is that the kind of thing that you or your company do? The investment in the stock market, is that niche, or is that quite generalistic from a kind of finance perspective?
I think it's probably quite general. Is it a good thing to invest? Yes, it is. There's different mediums to do that. So if there's DIY platforms where you can set up something at relatively low cost, lots of financial education on there. There's all sorts of brands available. Hargreaves Lansdown is probably the most well-known one, but you've got other people there, which will get you into is pretty easy to set up and pretty flexible, and means that you can read up about it. There'll be information on there. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff on YouTube, and God forbid TikTok. But I think again, I think you've got, like anything in life, you've probably got to be a bit careful about your sources, because it is slightly Wild West on the internet, and our regulator, the Financial Conduct Authority, is looking at what people are watching and what outcomes does it lead to, and a lot of information on social media, or a lot of it is too good to be true, and people end up losing money. So I think you need to go to a kind of reputable, established company as opposed to a fin influencer. So yeah, because again, I think if you're doing something like crypto is a big thing, well, I think if you're doing that, you need to kind of work on the basis that you can afford to take that risk, so that money you put in could go to zero. Whereas if you're going to the stock market, it might not be as high octane as an exciting, but consistently it will give you a good return.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So yeah, I think some of the key things that I pulled out from there would be, from an employment perspective, look what your benefits are, because I think it can be really common for those to just kind of hover around and exist, but as not really pull them down and either use them or interestingly, as you said, just ask if they can be changed or converted, which would be helpful. And also from an employer's perspective, to remember to use those from a recruitment and advertising, because they are a big value proposition, aren't they, when you or they can be, to help people choose where to work. But then again, when in terms of investments, I think the thing there is trusted source. Either and if you as an individual can't find that trusted source online, to find the right person, the trusted financial advisor to speak to, and that ties into also having that relationship with somebody that understands or can help you work out what your goals are, to make those personal decisions around risk appetite, how much you can afford to lose, because that's always a potential that might be there, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think in terms of investing into something like like a tracker fund or something like that, that the risk of permanent loss of money is pretty de minimis. What you've got to be prepared for there is the ups and downs of the stock market. So everybody at the moment is talking, have we got an AI bubble? Or so you've got something called the Magnificent Seven. So that is your things like Google, Meta, or Alphabet, I should say, Nvidia. All those kind of massive American tech companies which have had phenomenal growth actually over the last, I don't know, 5 or 6 years, something like that, maybe I'm beyond that actually. Are they overpriced at the moment? Are share prices going to collapse? I mean, in reality, nobody knows. But I think, it would drop in value. I think earlier in the year, actually, Nvidia dropped 30%, but it's back beyond where it was. So you've got to just be prepared for volatility. Now, the worst thing that people can do, and a lot of people have, I've seen a lot of people do this in my time, is sell when it drops. You have to be prepared for the fact that it's going to move up and down. And when it's down, that's fine. We expect that. What you do is don't panic and come out into cash and then go back in again when it's recovered. You just have to stay for the long term. And as long as if you're, I mean, most people I assume listening to this will be in this stage where they're trying to build wealth. They're not going to be using those assets particularly. Then you can, time is your friend. You want to think in kind of years, not days and months, basically, because over time that volatility will even out. And generally speaking, it's ticking its way. The values of your pensions, your ISAs will be increasing over time. So you need to think in years, not in short term.
Yeah. And then if we just move on to self-employment, and this is something I'm familiar with, having been employed and then self-employed and then employed and self-employed and hybrids and all sorts across my career. But it changes, right? The tax thing obviously is the most obvious one. How you're taxed and how even the fact that you do your self-assessment rather than it just kind of gets taken. But I think the financial scaffolding is different, and the level of risk is different, and potential that also the level of reward is different too.
Yes.
So if you could just give some advice or insight for people who are self-employed, things they should be thinking about, or if someone's contemplating a career move into self-employment, just some of those things that to be aware of at the beginning, the difference in financial scaffolding.
Well, I think obviously if you're moving to sell, well, you're on your own, aren't you? To all intents and purposes. So you need to make sure that you've got your arrangements covered. And I think it could be anything as simple as making sure you pay your kind of self-employed NI contributions, so that you're getting your state pension credits. I think you need to be thinking about, as I've sort of intimated earlier, you need to think about the tax liabilities that are going to come up. So obviously with PAYE, you don't need to think about it. Generally you don't need to file a tax return. But if you're self-employed, you're going to need to file a tax return. So, and the key date for that is 31st of January of following the year that you've been sort of self-employed. So you need to be making sure you're making provision for your tax. So, probably a good rule of thumb is any money that you make, you put 20% away in a bank account that is there for your tax. And if you're earning over 50, then it needs to be, or your fee income or whatever it might be is over 50, then that needs to be 40% of what you're earning, and you leave that to one side so that you can deal with your tax bill. That would be the most conservative approach. So I have clients who definitely take that approach, and then slightly more reckless people who think I'll just pay that tax bill out of income. Not that I would not recommend that, because you don't want to be scrabbling around for your sort of January payments. So that there's that from a practical tax perspective. I think now you haven't got a pension or that's sort of gone. So you want to think about, setting up a pension. You can make contributions into that will help save some tax. So if you, depending on your tax position, you could put £100 into your pension, and it only costs you 60 by the time you've done your tax return and you've filed your tax. You've sort of paid your tax. You can recoup some of that tax that's been paid. So that's why pensions are ultimately quite attractive. But obviously, once that's money is in, you're not going to be able to touch it till they're changing the age from 55 to 57. So that needs to be real, money you don't need. Probably need to think about, again, having a cash buffer, and probably before you start, because if something happened to you, if you're not able to work, no one's giving you sick pay, do you need to put some policies in place to cover that? Again, if you've got dependents, you want some policies in place to cover if something, if the worst thing happened to you and you passed away, that there's some money there for your kind of dependents, your loved ones. So there's that sort of risk aspect of things. If something goes wrong, are you covered, and have a policy for it? Generally, if you're young, it's quite in the grand scheme of things, it's relatively inexpensive, and will, in all probability, you'll never need it. But in the possibility that you do, you'll be very glad that you've had it. And I've had clients where we've had things like keyman insurance, and someone's had breast cancer, and it's been really useful as an injection of money into that business at a really difficult time. Obviously, you probably want some padding if you're going to go on holiday. So I think, you've got to think about what you like practically. What do you need? And managing cash flow, because again, it might depend on the cash flow of your business that you need to be thinking about, which is more of a business question than probably I think they're interconnected with your personal finances. So I think managing the cash flow of kind of fees coming in is quite important. At initial stages is quite important. Then hopefully you get established, your cash flow gets more consistent, and then you can think about, again, that kind of what you're going to do in the future.
Yeah. And talk me through valuing a business, because this is something I hear quite a lot. I work with clients on exit planning, and people growing a business so that they can sell it for a set amount. How as a financial planner, wealth advisor, how do you approach that valuation of business, and what recommendations can you give to somebody who is on that journey, who wants to, they are self-employed because they want to have something that they can sell in the future?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert in business valuation, so I'll just give it you from sort of my perspective. So I think, broadly speaking, there's sort of two types of business. There's lifestyle businesses, which are not going to have the multiples that if you are the business, then that's not going to give you a huge multiple on exit. So, is it an established business? Can that business save without, sort of operate without you? Is that valuable? So I think, again, it sort of depends on what you're building and how valuable it is in that marketplace. And obviously that'll vary from marketplace to marketplace. I think, generally speaking, when we have clients that are coming to us with businesses, we in terms of the plan, we generally don't ascribe a high value to it, because we want you to, and again, it sort of depends on the business, but we want you to make sure you've got assets outside of that business. So I think as you're building your business, there's the argument for making sure that all your assets aren't focused in that business. So, a typical refrain from business owners is, my business is my pension. Well, that's quite risky. What if your business doesn't last? Because business, we never think it's going to happen to us. So you want some diversification to manage the risk of that, I think. And if you've got a limited company making pension contributions, employer pension contributions is a deductible cost for corporation tax. It means it's taken that money out of the business. It's in your personal hands now. It's protected in the event of bankruptcy and all that sort of stuff. So, we're always hoping that it's going to be successful, but I think we have to keep an eye on the fact that sometimes it's not. No one wants to hear that, though, particularly, but that's kind of the reality of situations. And then I think, if you're going to exit, it's going to take that's probably going to take 3 years. You probably want to be thinking about that in 5 years in advance, I would say, of when you probably want to finish, if not even a bit more, because you're going to need to prep your business for sale. There's a whole process. The amount of due diligence is not a easy, stress-free period in your kind of business when you're trying to sell, and the lawyers are coming in and, have you got this document from 5 years ago, all that kind of. So having your systems in place is quite key, I think, and having your information for when someone comes in and starts to look at your business and start to pull it apart. And again, you might have a figure in your head that you need to test that, because is that real? Is someone actually going to, a bit like your house, isn't it? You might have a value in your head, but is someone actually going to pay you that value? Because obviously we all put sort of blood, sweat and tears into these things, and they're worth more to probably us than they might be externally. So I think you've got to kind of test what it's worth, and then I think, we can do work with people around, what do I need to sell my business for? What is the amount of money that I need? Because sometimes you might think you need more than you do, and that can be quite freeing and quite useful in the context for negotiations. And it might mean that you don't walk away from a good deal because it isn't quite on this number that you've anchored on, whereas in reality you might not quite need that number, or equally you might need a bigger number. So ergo, you need to think about what you're going to do in the business to support that number that you do want. So I think it's quite a involved process, I think. So having a good understanding, like all these things, I think you need context for decision making. So again, where I will come in with clients is I will give them context in terms of, what is the number that you need for this, or what is the amount of risk that you need to take, or this is the amount of contributions that you need to make, or this is the amount of, later in life, this is the amount of money you can give away to your children and still not be a burden and still feel, and still be fine. So I think having a really good understanding of the numbers is important. And in reality, I don't think most people are in a place to be able to do that work. And or if they are, then you need someone to proofread it. So and challenge you, and challenge maybe some of your assumptions and all those sorts of things. So I think people, hopefully most people who are running business have a good strategic accountant, tax advisor, because that's generally where most SME people get their kind of advice from, is their tax advisor. But there's a sort of difference between someone who's doing a compliance job, i.e. doing your returns for you, versus someone who's giving you kind of forward-thinking advice. And I think a good financial planner, working alongside a business owner and the accountant can make that quite powerful, because I think it means people understand what they need to do. I've sort of sat with people before and told them what they need to. This is what you need to earn. This is what needs to be done. So you're coming from a position of clarity and understanding, as opposed to it's okay and it's all a bit abstract. It gets very clear and very sort of precise. And you might not always make those things, but at least you know what they are.
Yeah, and it makes sense, doesn't it? I think, as a business owner or somebody working in a business, the notion of having some form of strategy, or even just some kind of operational plan, makes sense. So to do that in a similar way for your own financial structure makes equal sense. And actually that's more important, because that's about your personal life and what you are or aren't going to be able to do in the future. So just, I guess on that, but moving into the next area is that I wanted to talk about was liquidity and legacy, and the notion of having wealth, but having access to wealth, and just what those terms mean, and the things that we need to think about when we kind of hear those words.
I think liquidity to me means that you've got access to money, because you could be, I think it's that, what's the term, sort of property rich but income poor. It's a bit like the person who, someone might live in a stately home but it's crumbling around them. So on paper it looks great, but in reality, there's not the money to support the lifestyle or the kind of expenses that are needed for that. So I think liquidity means that you've got access to money, and you can basically support your lifestyle, and you're not, which potentially, if you think about your own business, that generally isn't particularly liquid. It's not going to, it's called patient capital for a reason, i.e. you're going to put money in and you're not going to be accessing that money for some time. Now you might have an income coming from it, but the day where you have the kind of multiple payoff might be way down the line. So what are you doing in between, versus maybe you've come to the point where you're now looking at, right, well, I've sold that business. Do you then go and wrap all your money up into something? Are you some sort of serial entrepreneur, and i.e. that money goes off elsewhere and isn't necessarily particularly available? versus that's it now. I've sort of, I've done my good job, and I'm going to now take these funds and use them to do something else. So I think liquidity to me means having money available to meet your kind of, whatever you want to do in life, really. And having your ratios clear. And most investments, I know, again, we talk about volatility, but most investments are pretty, are pretty liquid. If you could have your portfolio back in a week or two, but we say the reason that it's long term is that volatility. So if the market's up, then great, but if the market's down, you want to be able to wait for it to recover.
Yeah. And then in terms of legacy, that would be the thing that we're building towards, whether it's elements of liquidity along the way, but the bit that's then it is wrapped up, that is higher performing from an investment perspective.
Yeah, well, I suppose so legacy to me is probably thinking about cascading money. Well, you're building something, so it might be, sometimes your business is moving to the next generation, or you want to keep your business running, because that's something most people, it's been their baby, hasn't it? And they've built it over years, and to sort of let it go becomes quite hard, and maybe you don't want to let it go, and maybe you want to do a different view in terms of succession. So I think legacy to me is probably something around what you've built over the long term and what is going to be passed down. And that again means different things to different people. Some people very much want to keep money within their kind of family line. Other people quite philanthropic. There's people who want to donate to things in their community. I had somebody not that long ago who'd had given sort of quite a substantial amount of money to a sort of sports club for children in his village. So it means different things to different people, doesn't it? But I suppose it's how you support your family and your wider community.
Yeah, and I
What
guess
I'd see
thinking
as
about
legacy.
that early enough so that you can plan for it. One of the things, before we kind of just move on to the money confidence element, is inheritance. And I know it's a massive area that we could spend ages talking about, but just again for people listening, because I know from recent conversations I've had, the notion of when you need to be planning for inheritance and that kind of the number of years. What is the current advice in the market at the moment in terms of preparing our finances?
I think so. Again, I think it depends on where, it's sort of back to that. Have I got enough, or am I kind of overflowing? If you've got plenty and you could be in your 40s and start thinking about it. If it's sort of moderate, then it's probably I would say start thinking and maybe taking some action in your 60s, certainly in your 70s. But it all depends. At the moment there's been a big change to business relief. So people who have got businesses and big businesses, valuable businesses, there's a lot of activity going on now because after April, well, actually in farming families as well, after April next year, you're going to be limited in the amount that you can pass along tax free. So I know a lot of people who are putting their company shares into trust, or part of their company shares into trust because they want to pass that money on now before it's sort of capped, before it's capped out, really. So I think, generally speaking, where this might be is hard to say, but I would say you're accruing, and you get to a point where you probably tip over and you've got enough and excess, and at that point, that is when you're thinking about, your legacy planning. Now, there's things around that, how old are your children? Is it particularly helpful to have a big injection of money maybe when you're in your teens or in your early 20s? I think it depends on the messages they've got. Some children, that would be fine. Some children really wouldn't be fine. So you don't want those kind of gifts to send someone off kilter. And I know a lot of kind of parents, clients do worry that money is going to be of benefit to their children, as opposed to them sort of becoming feckless and not being able to kind of do, not and sending them off track, because work is it gives you purpose, doesn't it? It's valuable. It's I love my job. So I couldn't imagine sort of having lots of money and sitting round particularly. And I think, and that's also true for people who sold their businesses. You need to think about what you're going to do after, not just from a financial perspective, but also from a kind of purpose perspective. What does life look like? So I would say most people, probably it's in their 60s that they need to start thinking about it. And I think you might not take any action, but you think about it so you know what the options are. Otherwise, if you're trying to do it in your 80s, in reality, there's certain, there's lots, again, there's studies around this. It's harder to take on new concepts in your 80s. And I also think you get used to things being set in a certain way. So again, it's quite hard to change them. So potentially, people don't take action because they get to the point where, I don't know, it feels like it's sort of too late, or it's too difficult, or they don't quite understand it. So you need to be thinking about it, I would say, sort of, especially if you sold your bit, if you've had a big transition, i.e. you've had an inflow of money, either you've had an inheritance, because sometimes we're looking at 50-year-olds having inheritances from 80-year-olds, then it might be you don't need that and you want to skip a generation. So I think it's when there's a transition is when that's a good point to go and have a look at it and take advice and see what is relevant for you.
Yeah. Okay. So just into the final section on money confidence, and really your tips for somebody listening to be able to build their confidence and their understanding of finance and investment.
Again, I think having a good understanding of where you are now is really key. Now, if you can't, if you haven't got the skills and the capacity or the time or whatever, if there's a barrier for you to doing that, then you should go and get advice. Not necessarily from me, but you should get advice to understand where you are at the moment, because that will dictate, where you are today. We need to know where you want to get to, and then the plan should then fit those goals. So I would say having a really good understanding of where you are today, and I would sort of embrace that. So I have clients coming in feeling really nervous about where are they? I haven't done enough, or it's going to, I'm going to be living on baked beans in retirement. It's going to be awful. And then they come and see me and they realise actually it's okay. They're fine. So a lot of people potentially have got it, there's that underconfidence and overconfidence. So I think understanding where you are is really key. And I think having, your affairs in order will just make you feel really confident and just better about things. If you've got any kind of reticence or nervousness about it, I think having a conversation with somebody will probably allay a huge percentage of those fears and worries, and put you just in a much better position. Again, all the sort of studies suggest that somebody with an advisor will feel much more confident and better about the world than somebody who doesn't have one. But there's a cost to it, so you've got to. But then there's things like money. There is sort of free resources out there, I think. But you need to kind of get. I suppose you need to get to a critical kind of mass to get to that point, to get that advice really. But there'll be, again, if you've got people around you who are in a similar position, I'd go and talk to them about who they're talking to. Have they got an advisor? And then that's probably a good place to start, really, going from recommendation. But there's places like Vouch For, which will give you advisors in your local area. You can see what their clients are saying about them, and if they're any good or not.
Yeah, and I think, and all the way through it, I think that thing about the trust, work with somebody that you trust to understand you as an individual, not just the numbers on a spreadsheet, is really, really important, isn't it? Really important.
Completely important, because everything needs to hang. You're not starting with the solution. You need to start with the questions, and you need to start with what is important to you. And it might be you've not thought about these things particularly, but hopefully a good advisor will get you thinking about it.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for all of your advice. Just the last question, signature question, if you could give couple of top tips to somebody right now who wants to just take a look at what they're doing and improve their financial positioning, what would they be?
I would say, do you make your balance sheet? So I list out your assets and your liabilities and see where you are, and look at your income and your expenditure and see where you are there. That is a good starting place. And yeah, invest. Don't set. Once you've got your cash fund, then start investing. Whether that's, although it's not quite as a favourable environment as it used to be, whether that's buying an extra property or putting money into your pension, invest in things that actually grow. Those are my
Wonderful.
top tips. And join
Thank
the
you very
pension
much.
early. Yeah.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thanks, Sarah.
You've been listening to The Balancing Act for mastering work, wealth and wellbeing. You can head over to the website for further insight, links and resources related to this episode at www.balancing-act.co.uk, and remember to subscribe to catch all the new episodes as they're released.